All right, welcome. This is your video for AMSCO chapter 4.3, and the chapter title is Colombian Exchange. So, Colombian Exchange is chapter title, and here's a summary. Connections between Eastern and Western hemispheres, starting with the journey of Christopher Columbus, led to major changes throughout the world. Also, had through a period at the end of that sentence right there. What you're going to notice next is vocabulary, and there's quite a bit of vocabulary. The good news is the vocabulary is most of what's in the notes for this video. The rest is basically just kind of a brief explanation of what the vocabulary is. So let's go to it. So the Colombian Exchange is the links, the connections, the exchanges between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, including foods, animals, diseases, etc. Conquistadors are Spanish soldiers such as Pizarro and Cortez who conquered indigenous empires in the Americas. Cortez conquered the Aztecs and Pizarro conquered the Incas. Smallpox, very contagious viral disease, common in Europe and non-existent in the Americas before the arrival of the Spanish explorers. The horse, domesticated animal from Europe that transformed Native American culture in the Plains region. If you imagine like Comanche warriors riding on the Great Plains on horses, none of that happened before horses arrived from Europe. Maize is corn. Cacao, or cocoa, is a seed used to make chocolate. Okra, green vegetable from Africa. Time for a picture. There's okra. Hooray! All right, and we gotta do the thing, or make the thing, get back to the full screen. There's okra. All right, rice. Grain brought by Africans to the Americas. That's the important thing about the rice, because now you know what rice is. All right, sugarcane, tropical plant used to make sugar, molasses, and rum. Transatlantic slave trade, the sale of African slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Moving right along. All right. Engenos. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that in Portuguese, but it's a Portuguese word for engines, and it was used to describe sugar plantations because they processed so much sugar. A cash crop is a crop grown for sale rather than for personal use. The African diaspora is a group of worldwide communities descended from Africans, especially in the Caribbean and the Americas. Creole, or languages that blended African and European words and grammar together. Gumbo, an American dish with roots in African cooking. You may have seen it in The Princess and the Frog, or you may have even eaten some. It's delicious. I recommend it. All right, so the first subtopic in 4.3 is diseases and population catastrophe. And what you need to know here is that the Native Americans, the indigenous people of the Americas, had no resistance to diseases such as smallpox. So what you got when Europeans arrived to the Americas is what's called a virgin soil epidemic, which is when a new disease comes to, or it could be an old disease, comes to a place where it's never been experienced before, and people have no natural resistance. So in less than a century, the entire population of the Americas was reduced by 15%. I'm sorry, I said 15, but right there, 50 is correct. There are some communities where 90% of the community died out just from disease. 4.3, next subtopic is animals and foods. So, with the Colombian Exchange, livestock and food moved into the two hemispheres for the first time. So here's some notable examples. From Europe, you've got cows, you have pigs, you have horses. From the Americas, you've got maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, peppers, and cocoa for chocolate. Now, the major effect of this was that it led to population growth in Europe with all these new sources of nutrition. If you get in any kind of search engine and search up Colombian Exchange image, you can see all sorts of stuff that went back and forth in addition to these things I just mentioned. And the next section is called cash crops and forced labor. So the various European countries making colonies in the Americas used forced labor to make money from cash crops. There's different kinds of forced labor. So there's a section here called the lure of sugar. So the Portuguese noticed that Brazil had a good climate for growing sugarcane. And they first tried enslaving native people, but a lot of them would die from the new diseases, or they would escape. And if they escaped, they had communities they could escape to, because maybe they needed family, they had friends, or they had other communities outside where they could escape and go stay with, and it was hard to track them down. So the Portuguese started importing people from Africa to work in the sugarcane fields and in sugarcane processing, which leads us to slavery. So the Portuguese realized that they can make a lot of money processing sugar, but they need people to do the work. So they're looking to enslave people. 90% of slaves from Africa went to South America and the Caribbean. And slavery in these ingenos, in the sugarcane factories or sugarcane processing areas, was often fatal. People were literally being worked to death, and they had to keep importing slaves to keep everyone from just dying off. So at first, when the Spanish and Portuguese came to the Americas, they're like, we want precious metal. We've got to find gold. We've got to find silver. That's how we're going to get rich. And they realized over time that growing things like sugar and tobacco and selling them was even better than trying to just dig gold and silver out of the ground. All right. So there's another section about the African presence in the Americas. The main idea here is that enslaved Africans maintain parts of their culture even in the diaspora, even in the area where they've left their homeland and they're off in these foreign places. So one example is languages. You see Creole languages, which is a blend of African languages with European ones. You also see African influence in music throughout the Americas. You see it in blues and jazz, gospel, rock and roll, hip hop, samba, reggae, and country music. There are whole books on music of the African diaspora. It's a fascinating topic. Enslaved Africans also invented the banjo. And you also see the influence of African culture in food. So you see things like rice and okra in the Americas, and especially the techniques for cultivating rice were brought over by enslaved people from Africa. And an example in your book uses gumbo as an example of food with African influence. So the next subtopic is environmental and demographic impact. So one major effect of European arrival in the Americas is that the Europeans are cutting down more trees and farming more intensively and more intensely than Native Americans had. And so because of that, there's deforestation and also depletion of nutrients in the soil. Because if you try to grow the same thing, like say cotton, over and over again in the same soil, you're pulling out nutrients. And not all the people who arrived in the Americas knew how to rotate their crops and using different systems in different fields. And so they very quickly exhausted the nutrients in the land. In addition, they set up more populated settlements, which led to more concentrated areas of pollution. And that's the end of chapter 4.3. And 4.4 is a biggie, so prepare yourselves.